Every perfect crime begins with something hopeful, a fresh start, a second chance, a belief that the past can be outrun. For Daniel Cooper, that belief crossed an ocean. He came to America carrying grief that never fully left his hands. A widower in his early 40s, Daniel had already buried one life and one love before he ever stepped onto American soil. Back home in Ireland, tragedy had reshaped him. His first wife had died suddenly, leaving him alone with 2 young children and a silence that filled every room they entered. Friends described Daniel as gentle, soft-spoken, a man who carried responsibility like a weight he never complained about. He wasn't looking for excitement. He was looking for stability. And America, to him, offered exactly that: a new job, a quiet neighborhood, better schools. A clean slate for his children. By the time Daniel settled into a modest home in a small North Carolina town, he believed he was finally building something safe. But safety, as it turns out, is often an illusion. Daniel's children were still young, old enough to remember loss, but young enough to hope again. They needed structure, routine. Someone who could help hold the pieces together while their father worked long hours to provide the life he promised them. That's when Rachel Hayes entered their lives. Rachel was in her late 20s when she arrived. Warm smile, calm voice, the kind of presence that put anxious children at ease. She came recommended, trustworthy, patient. At first, she was simply the nanny. She cooked, she helped with homework. She learned the rhythms of the household quickly. Too quickly, some would later say. But in those early months, nothing felt alarming. It felt natural. Daniel saw someone who cared for his children as if they were her own. The children saw comfort where they had known disruption. And Rachel saw something else entirely: a family still healing, a man still vulnerable, a home where boundaries were quietly dissolving. Over time, the lines blurred. The nanny became more than help. She became companionship. Long conversations replaced formal schedules. Shared dinners replaced professional distance. Daniel wasn't looking for love, but loneliness has a way of lowering defenses without asking permission, and Rachel understood that. Friends noticed the change before Daniel did. The way she spoke for him in conversations, the way she managed the household without being asked, the way she positioned herself not just beside him, but between him and the rest of the world. Eventually, the relationship became official. To outsiders, it looked like healing, a widower finding happiness again, a blended family finding balance. To those closest to Daniel, it felt rushed. But love, when framed as rescue, often is. They married quietly, no grand ceremony, no spectacle, just a promise that this time things would be different. They moved into a larger home, one with hallways long enough to echo and rooms where voices could travel without being overheard. It was there that the marriage began to change. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but subtly. Arguments stayed behind closed doors. Tension lived in pauses rather than shouting. Control appeared disguised as concern. And the children, the only constant witnesses, learned quickly when to stay silent. To neighbors, the house looked peaceful. Lights on at night, a well-kept lawn, a family rebuilding itself. But inside those walls, something fragile was forming, a marriage built on grief, a partnership shaped by power, a story that would soon split into 2 versions, both claiming to be the truth. And on a quiet night years later, when violence finally shattered the illusion, the question wouldn't be what happened. It would be who was telling the truth. Because when the police arrived, there were no neutral witnesses, only survivors. And in a house built on silence, the truth would become the most contested thing of all. From the outside, the Cooper household appeared calm. No police calls, no public arguments, no visible chaos. But the most dangerous fractures don't announce themselves loudly. They whisper, they erode, they wait. Inside the marriage, something had begun to shift. Not all at once, but piece by piece. Daniel had always been structured, predictable. Routine gave him comfort after years of loss. Rachel, on the other hand, thrived in ambiguity. She framed herself as adaptable, supportive, endlessly understanding. But understanding can be a form of leverage, especially when one person knows exactly where the other is weakest. At first, her influence felt helpful. She reorganized the home, managed schedules, handled conversations Daniel found emotionally exhausting. She spoke for him, gently at first. "He's just tired." "He doesn't mean it that way." "I'll take care of it." Slowly, Daniel stopped noticing when decisions stopped being his. Friends noticed the change before he did. Daniel spoke less, deferred more, hesitated before answering simple questions. When asked how the marriage was going, he smiled. But the smile arrived a second too late. Rachel, however, spoke confidently. She described the household as demanding, the children as difficult, Daniel as emotionally distant. Her narrative was always reasonable, measured, just enough concern to sound believable. And when tension surfaced, it was reframed as sacrifice. "I gave up my independence for this family. I'm the one holding everything together. I don't feel supported." To anyone listening casually, she sounded like a woman overwhelmed. To anyone listening closely, she sounded like someone building a case. Inside the house, arguments never exploded. They condensed. Words were chosen carefully. Silences were strategic. Disagreements ended not with resolution, but exhaustion. Daniel withdrew. Not because he didn't care, but because he didn't recognize the man he was becoming inside his own home. He began doubting his instincts, his memory, his reactions. When he pushed back, he was told he was aggressive. When he stayed quiet, he was told he was cold. There was no correct response. And over time, that uncertainty became a form of control. The children sensed it. They learned when to leave the room, when not to speak, when to watch their father closely and say nothing. Later, they would describe the house as tense, not loud, but heavy, as if every conversation carried consequences. Rachel maintained order. Rules were enforced. Structure was demanded. But affection became conditional. Approval fluctuated. And Daniel found himself increasingly isolated, emotionally and socially, from the people who once grounded him. Isolation is not accidental in these stories. It is engineered. To outsiders, Rachel portrayed herself as the stabilizing force. To authorities, she would later describe the marriage as volatile. And to Daniel, she framed herself as the only one capable of handling what she quietly defined as his instability. It was a subtle reversal, one that would matter deeply when everything fell apart. Because by the time cracks became visible, the story had already been written. The question was no longer whether something would happen. It was how it would be explained once it did. On the night everything ended, there would be no neutral witnesses, only two people inside the house. Only one version of events would survive intact, and long before that night arrived, the groundwork had already been laid. By the time night fell, the house was already quiet, too quiet. The children were asleep upstairs. The doors were locked. The outside world had receded into darkness. Inside, only two adults remained awake. Two people carrying years of unspoken resentment, rewritten memories, and unresolved power struggles. This was not a sudden explosion. It was the end of a long compression. Earlier that evening, neighbors would later report nothing unusual. No shouting, no crashing sounds, no signs of a disturbance that would demand attention. That absence would become important, because when violence finally arrived, it arrived fast and without witnesses. According to Rachel's account, the argument began over something small. A disagreement, a misunderstanding, a moment that escalated. She described Daniel as unpredictable, agitated, threatening. She said she feared for her life. In her version, the confrontation spiraled out of control. A man driven by rage, a woman forced to defend herself. But here's what investigators would later struggle with. There were no calls to emergency services before the incident, no attempt to leave the house, no evidence of a prolonged struggle, only aftermath. At some point during the night, Daniel was struck, not once, not accidentally, but with enough force to cause catastrophic injuries, blows delivered at close range, inside a confined space, with no opportunity to retreat. When first responders arrived, they found Daniel unresponsive. His injuries were severe. Inconsistent with a chaotic fight, more aligned with sustained impact. Yet Rachel remained composed, controlled. She spoke clearly, answered questions precisely, reiterated one central claim. This was self-defense. The children were kept upstairs. They did not see what happened. They did not hear everything. But later, fragments would surface. Sounds that didn't match panic, timing that didn't align with sudden fear, and a stillness afterward that felt deliberate. Investigators immediately recognized a problem. There was no neutral narrative, only Rachel's account, only the physical evidence, and the scene itself told two stories at once, neither of them complete. There were signs of an argument, but also signs of control. Objects moved, but not overturned. Damage, but not chaos. A house that had absorbed tension for years and released it all at once. Rachel maintained her version without deviation. She said Daniel attacked first. She said she had no choice. She said she was protecting herself and the children. But as the night unfolded, inconsistencies began to surface. Small ones, the kind that don't shatter a story immediately, but weaken it quietly. And once doubt enters a narrative like this, it never leaves. By morning, Daniel was gone, and the marriage, once presented as functional, strained but survivable, was now reduced to two irreconcilable truths. One man dead, one woman alive, and a question that would haunt every courtroom, investigator, and juror who touched this case. Was this an act of desperation, or the final move in a story that had been unfolding long before that night? In the hours after Daniel Cooper's death, the house became something else, not a home, not a marriage, a scene. Investigators moved carefully, aware that every detail mattered, especially in a case with no independent witnesses and a claim of self-defense. They photographed the room where Daniel collapsed, measured distances, cataloged objects, and almost immediately questions emerged. The injuries told a story. Daniel had suffered multiple blows to the head, severe, focused. Medical examiners noted trauma inconsistent with a sudden, chaotic struggle. There were no significant defensive wounds on Rachel. No injuries suggesting she had been overpowered. No signs she had attempted to flee or barricade herself. This didn't disprove her story, but it didn't confirm it either. Then came the timeline. Rachel stated that the confrontation escalated rapidly, that fear drove her actions, that she reacted instinctively. But phone records suggested gaps, minutes unaccounted for, no frantic calls, no immediate outreach for help. And when emergency services were finally contacted, her tone remained measured, calm, under circumstances that would normally produce shock. Again, not evidence of guilt, but not what investigators expected. The house itself added to the confusion. There was damage, but controlled damage. Objects displaced, but not destroyed. Furniture shifted, but not overturned. It didn't resemble a violent eruption. It looked contained. As if force had been applied deliberately, not desperately. Then investigators began interviewing people who knew the marriage. Daniel's friends described him as reserved, conflict avoidant, a man more likely to withdraw than confront. Rachel's supporters described her as overwhelmed, emotionally exhausted, carrying the weight of a difficult relationship. Both descriptions could be true. And that's what made the case dangerous. The children's accounts were limited. They heard raised voices, but not screaming. They recalled tension, but not chaos. What stood out most was what they didn't remember. No frantic movement, no prolonged argument, just a sudden end. For investigators, the problem became clear. This was not a case that would be solved by a single piece of evidence. It would be decided by interpretation, by which narrative aligned most convincingly with the physical facts. And as evidence accumulated, the gap between story and scene widened. Rachel remained consistent. Her version never shifted, never cracked, never adapted. To some, that steadiness suggested truth. To others, it felt rehearsed. And in cases like this, consistency can be read two ways, as honesty or as preparation. By the end of the first week, investigators knew one thing for certain. This was not a simple case of self-defense, but it was not a clear-cut murder either. It was something more complicated, more uncomfortable, a marriage that had collapsed under pressure and left behind a story that could not fully explain the damage done. Soon, the case would leave the quiet confines of forensic analysis and enter a far more volatile arena: public opinion. And once that happened, the truth would no longer belong solely to evidence. It would belong to whoever told the better story. When Daniel Cooper died, the violence did not end inside the house. It spread into families, into communities, into the public imagination. Because almost immediately, two versions of the truth began competing for oxygen, and both claimed to be protecting the same thing: Daniel's children. Daniel's family saw the situation clearly. To them, there was no ambiguity. They saw a man who had already survived unimaginable loss, a father who dedicated his life to his children, a person they described as gentle, controlled, and deeply private. They could not reconcile that image with the story being told. They asked questions that investigators were already struggling to answer. Why were there no serious injuries on Rachel? Why did the scene feel contained rather than chaotic? Why did the explanation rely entirely on her account? To Daniel's family, the idea that he suddenly became violent in his own home felt impossible, and they said so, publicly. Rachel's family told a different story. They described her as trapped, emotionally worn down, living inside a marriage that had become unpredictable and frightening. They spoke of control, of intimidation, of a man who, behind closed doors, was not the person outsiders believed him to be. In their version, Rachel did not act out of anger. She acted out of survival, and they insisted the justice system must understand that difference. The children became the center of everything. Two sides claimed to be acting in their best interest. Two families argued over who could offer safety, stability, and truth. But the children themselves were not allowed to speak publicly. Their silence became its own battleground. Every statement made by adults was framed as protection, even when it deepened the divide. As media attention grew, the case transformed. Headlines simplified what evidence complicated. Self-defense or murder? Tragic marriage ends in blood. Who was telling the truth? The public was forced to choose, and they did. Some believed Rachel immediately. Others believed Daniel's family just as fiercely. The middle ground disappeared. Investigators felt the pressure. Every move was scrutinized. Every delay criticized. Every unanswered question amplified. But the facts remained stubborn. There was no definitive proof that Daniel planned violence. There was no clear evidence Rachel attempted escape. There was no witness who saw what happened, only aftermath, only interpretation. As weeks turned into months, one truth became unavoidable. This case would not be resolved quietly. It would not end with a single forensic report or expert conclusion. It would be decided in a courtroom, where emotion, credibility, and narrative often carry as much weight as evidence. And when charges were finally filed, the story reached a point of no return. Because now, someone would have to be held responsible. And once the legal system chose a side, one version of the truth would be formally rejected, even if doubts remained. When the trial finally began, the courtroom became the only place where truth was allowed to exist. Or so it seemed. Daniel Cooper's death was no longer a family tragedy. It was a legal problem, and the law does not deal in feelings. It deals in evidence, credibility, and burden of proof. The prosecution went first. They did not describe a sudden act of self-defense. They described a pattern, a marriage built on control, an argument that escalated, a level of force that exceeded fear. They walked jurors through Daniel's injuries, slowly, methodically, multiple blows, focused trauma, damage inconsistent with a frantic, panicked response. This, they argued, was not instinct. It was intention. Then came the timeline, phone records, movement inside the house, the absence of calls before the incident. Why didn't Rachel leave? Why didn't she call for help sooner? Why did she remain composed while Daniel lay dying? The prosecution did not accuse her of malice. They accused her of choice. The defense told a different story. They spoke of fear that does not announce itself loudly, of abuse that leaves no marks, of moments where survival overrides reason. They argued that calm is not proof of guilt, that trauma manifests differently in different people. They asked jurors to imagine being trapped in a house with someone they feared, and reacting not perfectly but instinctively. Rachel took the stand. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She spoke slowly, carefully, and that restraint would divide the room. To some jurors, her composure felt genuine. To others, it felt unsettling. Daniel's family watched silently as his life was reduced to opposing arguments. Rachel's family listened as her actions were dissected frame by frame. The children were mentioned, but shielded. Their presence hung over every testimony like a warning. Experts followed, medical examiners, forensic analysts, behavioral specialists. Each clarified a piece of the puzzle. None completed it. Because this case did not hinge on what could have happened. It hinged on what jurors believed did happen. Inside a house with no witnesses and two competing truths. As closing arguments approached, one reality became clear. This trial would not offer certainty. It would offer resolution. And those two things are not the same. When the jury returned, the courtroom fell silent. Not the polite silence of procedure, but the kind that settles when everyone understands that whatever comes next cannot be undone. Daniel Cooper's family sat rigid. Rachel remained still, hands folded, eyes forward. No one spoke, because at this point words had lost their power. The jury foreperson stood. The verdict was read slowly, measured, deliberate. Rachel Hayes was found guilty.